Think about the last time you held yourself back from something. Not because you couldn't do it, not because the opportunity wasn't there, but because something inside you, something that felt like wisdom or prudence, or simply knowing yourself said, "Not yet," or "Maybe later," or most quietly and most persistently, "This is not really for someone like me." Paul Tillich was a German-American philosopher and theologian who spent his career studying exactly that feeling. He gave it a name. He called it the failure of courage. Not courage in the heroic sense, not courage as the absence of fear. Courage, in Tillich's sense, as something much simpler and much more radical, the ongoing act of affirming your own existence, in spite of every force that threatens to make you smaller. In this video, we will look at what Tillich discovered and why the courage he was describing may be the hardest thing a human being is ever asked to do. Stay with me. Paul Tillich published The Courage to Be in 1952. He had just lived through 2 world wars. He had been fired from his professorship in Frankfurt by the Nazis in 1933, among the first academics to be dismissed, and had rebuilt his life in America at Union Theological Seminary in New York. He had watched certainty collapse. He had watched meaning systems that generations had relied on simply stop working. What he observed around him, and what he had lived through himself, was not a problem that therapy could solve or that productivity could outrun. It was something more fundamental. He called it ontological anxiety, the anxiety that belongs not to individuals with particular pathologies, but to every human being who is awake enough to recognize the fragility of their own existence. Tillich argued that this anxiety cannot be cured. It cannot be reasoned away. It cannot be managed into submission. It is not a symptom of something wrong with you. It is a feature of being human, the specific discomfort that comes with being a finite creature who is aware of its own finitude. And he identified 3 forms in which it appears. The first is the anxiety of fate and death. This is the most basic and most universal. It is the awareness that you did not choose to exist, that everything about your circumstances is contingent, your body, your time, your place in history, and that all of it will end. Most people spend enormous energy trying not to think about this, and the energy spent not thinking about it is energy that could have gone elsewhere. The second is the anxiety of guilt and condemnation. This is the awareness that in every moral action, in every choice, in every moment of your life, you are falling short of what you could have been. You are actualizing some of your potential while leaving the rest unrealized. The gap between who you are and who you might have been is not a problem with a solution. It is the permanent condition of a free being in a finite life. The third is the anxiety of emptiness and meaninglessness. This is the anxiety that perhaps nothing you are doing ultimately matters, that the frameworks of meaning you have inherited or constructed might simply be insufficient, that what feels like purpose might be a story you are telling yourself to get through the day, and that the story might not hold. Tillich's observation was not that these anxieties are pathological. It was that they are real. They belong to existence itself. And the question is not how to make them disappear, but what you do when you encounter them. The most common response to ontological anxiety, Tillich observed, is flight. Not dramatic flight. Quiet, socially acceptable, often praised flight. The first form of flight is what he called the courage of conformity, the decision to dissolve the anxiety of individual existence by merging with a group. If I become sufficiently identified with my community, my nation, my ideology, my professional role, the terrifying question of who I am as an individual becomes manageable. I am not alone. I am one of us. The anxiety is absorbed into something larger. This works partially for a time. The problem is that it requires a continuous suppression of the individual self. The parts of you that do not fit the group, The doubts, the questions, the desires that belong specifically to you and not to the collective must be kept quiet. And the parts of you that are kept quiet do not disappear. They simply exert their pressure from somewhere less visible. The second form of flight is cynicism. Tillich described the cynic not as a philosopher, but as a strategist, someone who positions themselves outside genuine participation so that the risks of genuine participation cannot reach them. If I never fully commit, I cannot be fully betrayed. If I never fully hope, I cannot be fully disappointed. If I maintain enough ironic distance from anything that might actually matter, I can always claim I was never really invested. This too works, for a time, and it has the additional advantage of feeling like wisdom. The cynic appears to see more clearly than those who are still naive enough to care. What the cynic is actually doing, Tillich argued, is protecting himself from the very thing that makes life meaningful: the risk of genuine engagement with what you actually value. The third form of flight is the endless accumulation of activity, noise, and distraction, what might simply be called busyness. If there is never a quiet moment, the anxiety of meaninglessness cannot surface. If there is always something to do, something to achieve, something to consume, the question of whether any of it matters can be indefinitely postponed. All three of these strategies are recognizable. Most of us use at least one of them. Tillich did not condemn them. He simply observed what they cost. Tillich's definition of courage is not what most people expect. Courage, for Tillich, is not the absence of anxiety. It is not the suppression of doubt. It is not the confident march forward of someone who has resolved all of their questions and knows exactly what they are doing. Courage is the act of affirming your own existence in spite of the anxiety that threatens to unmake it. The two small words that appear again and again in Tillich's work are "in spite of." Courage is not achieved by eliminating what threatens you. It is achieved by continuing to be yourself despite what threatens you. This means something very specific. It means that the person who is anxious about death but continues to live fully and deliberately, not by pretending that death does not exist, but by refusing to let its existence shrink their life, is exercising the courage to be. The person who is aware of their moral failures, their gaps, their distances from what they might have been, but continues to act and choose and engage rather than collapsing into self-contempt, is exercising the courage to be. The person who faces the possibility that nothing is ultimately certain, that meaning is not guaranteed by the universe, and continues to invest genuinely in what they love, is exercising the courage to be. This is what Tillich meant when he wrote, "The courage to be is the courage to accept oneself as accepted in spite of being unacceptable." This is one of the most important sentences in 20th century psychology. It does not say, "Become acceptable." It does not say, "Fix what is wrong with you." It says, "The work is to accept the acceptance that is already present beneath the anxiety, beneath the guilt, beneath the sense of inadequacy, and to live from there." Notice the connection to what we have encountered in previous videos. Frankl showed us that meaning is found not in circumstances, but in the stance we take toward them. Fromm showed us that love requires a self that is genuinely present, not performing. Jung showed us that the self cannot be whole while it is hiding from itself. Horney showed us that the prison is built from the inside. Tillich now shows us what all of these insights require in practice: courage, the simple, radical, ongoing act of continuing to be. Tillich identified two complementary forms of the courage to be, and he argued that both are necessary and that the failure to hold both in tension is one of the great sources of human suffering. The first is the courage to be as a part, the courage of participation. This is the courage to be genuinely embedded in something larger than yourself. Not in the sense of losing yourself in conformity, but in the sense of genuine belonging. To be part of a community, a relationship, a tradition, a shared project with real investment, real risk, real exposure to the possibility of loss. Most people who have been hurt by genuine belonging retreat from it. They participate at a safe distance. They contribute without quite committing. They are present without being reachable. And they wonder why nothing ever quite feels like home. The courage of participation is the willingness to be fully in knowing that full participation makes full loss possible. The second is the courage to be as oneself, the courage of individuation. This is the courage to remain distinctly yourself within the groups and relationships and traditions you belong to, not to dissolve into them, not to suppress the parts of yourself that don't fit, not to exchange your actual self for the version that would be most acceptable to the people around you. These two forms of courage are in constant tension. Too much individuation without participation produces isolation, the self that has protected its distinctness so thoroughly that it has lost its connections. Too much participation without individuation produces conformity, the self that is merged so completely with the group that it no longer exists as a distinguishable person. Tillich's insight was that this tension is not a problem to be solved. It is the condition of a human life. The work is not to eliminate the tension, but to hold it honestly, to be genuinely part of something and genuinely yourself within it at the same time. This is easier to describe than to do. It requires, at every moment, exactly the courage he was writing about. Tillich wrote, "The courage to be in 1,952 inches, response to what he saw as the dominant spiritual crisis of his era, the anxiety of meaninglessness. Not the anxiety of death, which had been the central concern of earlier ages. Not the anxiety of guilt, which had been the central concern of the Reformation. But the specifically modern anxiety, the sense that the frameworks of meaning which previous generations had relied on had simply stopped working and that nothing had yet been found to replace them. He could not have anticipated the precise form that crisis would take in our time, but his diagnosis seems, if anything, sharper now. We live in a culture that has made a sophisticated art form of not quite committing, of hedging every investment of meaning with an awareness of its contingency, of maintaining enough distance from everything that might actually matter that we can always claim we were never really invested. We call this being realistic. We call it not getting our hopes up. We call it knowing how things work. Tillich would call it the failure of courage, not the dramatic failure of the coward on the battlefield, the quiet, daily, socially acceptable failure of the person who has decided that the risks of genuine engagement are too high and has spent years constructing an elaborate and highly functional life around the project of not quite being fully present in it. The anxiety, he described the anxiety of emptiness and meaninglessness, does not go away because you stop paying attention to it. It goes underground. It expresses itself in the specific quality of exhaustion that comes not from doing too much, but from never quite doing the thing that actually matters to you. The fatigue of constant management. The restlessness that persists even after rest. The courage Tillich was describing is not optional. It is, he argued, the condition of genuine human life. Without it, what remains is a life that functions but does not fully exist. Tillich was not interested in prescriptions. He was too honest for that. He knew that the courage to be is not something you decide to have one afternoon and then possess indefinitely. It is something you exercise or fail to exercise in every specific moment of your specific life. But if there is a beginning, it is probably this: the willingness to notice what you are avoiding, not in a spirit of self-accusation, not as another occasion for the kind of self-examination that Horney would recognize as the tyranny of the should, applied to the project of self-improvement. Simply, what is the thing you have been putting off that is not actually about external circumstances? What is the investment you have been postponing that does not require a different situation, but only a different orientation toward this one? What is the part of your actual self that you have been keeping quiet because you decided somewhere along the way that it was not welcome? The courage to be does not require certainty. It does not require the resolution of anxiety. It requires only the willingness to affirm your existence, in spite of everything that makes that feel difficult, and to take one small step in the direction of something that is genuinely yours. That step, repeated, is what Tillich called the courage to be. 5 videos, 5 thinkers, 1 argument. Frankl showed us that meaning cannot be pursued, it must be found in the honest encounter with your life. Fromm showed us that love is a skill, not a feeling, and it requires a self that is genuinely present. Jung showed us that the self cannot be whole while it is hiding from its own shadow. Horney showed us that we have built prisons from the inside, and we are holding the key. And Tillich now shows us what all of this requires. The ongoing, daily, in spite of everything courage to simply be. The most important work you will ever do is the work of becoming honest with yourself. Subscribe to the Lucid Mind, not to fill a feed, but to keep walking.